Algerians once again taking to the streets in a fresh wave of protests. They're demanding an end to the ailing president's 20-year rule. So is this Algeria's Arab Spring moment? Hello, I'm Arnold Naidu and this is The Heat. For nearly a month now, hundreds of thousands of Algerians have rallied in cities across the country calling for President Abdelaziz Bouteflika to step down. Bowing to public pressure, it seems he may have given in to some of their demands.
We will have new presidential elections, and until these elections, the president will remain in office. At the end of these elections, he will resign. The new president will be elected democratically and with full transparency.
Protesters, however, want Bouteflika and members of his inner circle to resign immediately. The Algerian president may have survived the 2011 Arab Spring that toppled other Arab leaders. But with a souring economy and a youth hungry for change, the sentiment on the street is that Bouteflika hasn't done enough to placate his own people as Algerians continue to march towards a new future. So what's next for Algeria? To discuss all of this, Francis Ghiles is in Barcelona. He's a senior research fellow at the Barcelona Centre for International Affairs. Joining us from Doha is Youcef Bouandel. He is Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at Qatar University. Also in Doha is Mohamed Kirat. He's Professor of Public Relations and Mass Communication at Doha University. And Yasmina Allouche is a journalist specializing in North Africa. She joins us from Istanbul in Turkey. Thanks to all of you for being with us. Youcef Bouandel, let me start with you. These protests have been going on for nearly a month right now. What started them in the first place?
What started them basically is Bouteflika's decision to run for the 5th term in office. Obviously, he changed the constitution in 2008 when he opened up all the mandates. And in 2014, he ran for his 3rd term in office and the very, very ill president. We saw pictures of an alien president who could not walk, who could not talk to his own people. And when he decided to run for a 5th term in office, Algerians said enough is enough, and they basically started to call for no to the 5th term. This is basically the first demand for the protesters not to the 5th term. They didn't want to see their country and their president humiliated. Over the last 5 or 6 years, the president was hardly seen. He spoke to his own people. The last time was in May 2012, and corruptions have hit highest levels in Algeria over the last 6 or 7 years. So all these combined let Algerians decide that enough is enough, and the president should not be, he's not able to run the country, and he should not be running for office.
Francis Ghiles, as we said earlier on, the president has given in to some of the demands. He's talked about a new political dispensation, although it's unclear what that dispensation will be. This has been described as the worst political crisis in Algeria since the civil war. Where do you see this heading, Francis?
Well, first of all, these are the biggest demonstrations since independence in 1962. There are millions of people in the street every weekend. Secondly, they're peaceful, which is quite something. And thirdly, the slogans of the younger, less young people are extremely savvy and sophisticated. I can't think of any other Arab country, indeed some European ones, where you would see slogans which show a very high level of political savviness. What they're asking is for a change in the system. Now, in a way, the army has been in power through different forces since 1962, and the ordinary people of Algeria were expelled from the theatre, if you will, from the stage in 1962. They're now asking to come back. And I think that the army is well aware that they have to give in to some extent. Now, to what extent they give in and how they manage to engineer a change in the system which opens it up, this is the great challenge they face. But I think that many officers are well aware that while some of their elders may be corrupt, including the Chief of Staff, General Gaid Salah, there are a lot of Algerian officers who are professional, honest, very well-educated people, and they wish to see their country move forward. So that's the challenge of the next few weeks.
Yasmina, let's look at the role of the military. Algeria has a very powerful military, but let's look at the role of the military in this current wave of demonstrations. So far, the army has remained in barracks, but its chief, who also happens to be the deputy defense minister, has described the protesters as having, quote, noble aims. How significant is that coming from the chief of the army?
So the military have maintained a protocol of neutrality where they're bound by the constitution to maintain peace and stability. So far, due to the mass protestation over the last month being largely peaceful, the army have remained in their barracks. But if we're looking at the rhetoric of the Chief of Staff, General Ghaid Salah, we're seeing a turn in the type of messaging that he's giving. So when the protests first broke out on February 22nd, he spoke about foreign hands in the, aiding this mobilization and a threat of a regression to the level of violence witnessed during the Black Decade of the Civil War in the 90s. That message then changed to acknowledgement that the people and the army have the same vision of the future. And then recently this week we saw how a sort of admiration of the patriotism of the people and a nod to how a solution for this current stagnation will come at a proper moment. When that is exactly is anyone's guess at the moment, but for now we can say that the military will remain closely observing the situation, and if there is any descent of a threat to violence for towards the people, then we can expect some a more forward action from the army.
Mohamed Kirat, of course, Algeria's neighbors in the region are looking at what's taking place very closely, and also its main foreign partners, particularly Russia, which is its closest foreign ally and one of the biggest suppliers of arms to Russia. The Deputy Prime Minister has been in Moscow. He's been holding talks with the Russians. This is what the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said after that meeting. Let's watch.
Our colleague has told us about the situation in Algeria. He shared the plans of the authorities for the near future, and we support these plans. We count on them to help stabilize the situation in this friendly state through a national dialogue based on the Algerian constitution and, of course, with respect of international law and the UN Charter by all of the interested nations.
So, Mohamed Kirat, those plans that Sergei Lavrov was referring to there are the unspecified plans which have been announced by the president. But if you listen to Lavrov there, it doesn't sound like a ringing endorsement of Bouteflika by the Russians. How significant is that?
Well, this is very, very important because, Russia has to watch out, and if you have the people in the streets, they have to go by the force of the street, of the public opinion, of the millions of Algerians who went to the street. So I think, he was very clever in his answer, and he was, focusing on, for foreign forces not to get in this internal affair of Algeria. Of course, Russia has important deals, economic deals with Algeria, and has very good relations with Algeria since the independence of Algeria in 1962. So they don't want to commit themselves and to side by Bouteflika. I don't think it will be a good decision from their part. So they are waiting on what's going to happen next, but they are favoring, national dialogue and the peaceful handling of the actual situation. But the problem now, so far, the army has been neutral and it is waiting. But the problem now, we have 1 month of demonstrations in the streets, 4 straight Fridays, and the situation has not changed, except for that Bouteflika stepped out from the 5th term, but he's still in power, and he doesn't want to let go. He's still there, and he wants, to be the architect of the Second Republic. He wants, to oversee this national conference and to choose automatically, who is going to replace him. But the people in the streets, they don't want him and his entourage, you know, just to go on and handle this critical transition. They want, you know, the whole team to be out of it.
Youcef Bouandel, Bouteflika is 82 years old. He suffered a stroke. He's really been seen in public since suffering that stroke. That's been the situation for quite some time right now. So who's running the country on a day-to-day basis? Who's in charge?
Well, before I go to answer this question, I would like to go back to Russia, because when we look at the terms used, because they are the Ramtan Al-Amamra, the Deputy Prime Minister of Algeria, referred to Sergei Lavrov as my friend Sergei, but the Sergei Lavrov didn't repay the compliment. So in other words, what we can see from what Lavrov said, it's not a very strong endorsement to Algeria. Who runs Algeria at the moment? This is $1 million question. The honest answer is nobody knows. We could ask the question differently. Who has been running Algeria over the last 6 or 7 years? The president had a stroke. He spent most of his time either in France or in Geneva at different hospitals. He was hardly seen in public. There is a small clique of his entourage run by his younger brother Said, and Said has been the de facto president for the last 5 years or so, surrounded by a very small clique of top businessmen, as well as Gaid Salah playing a role in that. But the honest answer is nobody knows who is running it.
Francis, if we look at the opposition that are staging these demonstrations right now, it's a diverse opposition, but it does include the country's trade unions. And what they have called for is Bouteflika and his inner circle to step down. That's what we do know. But what we don't know is what they want. What do they really want here?
Well, before I start, just one minor correction. Algeria is not an ally of Russia. I think one must correct this. They may buy a lot of weapons in Russia, but they've never been an ally of Russia. When it comes to the opposition, well, for the moment, the opposition is, first, it cuts across every region, gender, Berbers, Arabs, Islamists, non-Islamists. Everybody is united. That's the first thing. For the moment, they want the president to go, and they want to partake in the decision of who becomes the next president. This is where the system is going to have to evolve. Since 1962, basically senior officers and a few other people from the FLN, the single ruling party until recently, have in a sense anointed somebody who is then ratified by a popular vote. Now, this can't continue forever because the army likes to have historical continuity. And today they could very well appoint one of 2 or 3 people who have played a historical role in Algeria, who've been in the War of Liberation. But this will be the last time because by the very nature of biology, these people are dying. So one could well imagine the opposition agreeing to an interim president who could be one of 2 or 3 people, the former president, Yamin Zerwal, the former prime minister, Mouloud Hamrouche, who would assure an interim kind of role of rewriting the constitution and opening up the game and allowing for free and fair elections. So the army is going to have to decide exactly what it wants, because if it wants to, in a sense, ensure its own position as the ultimate guarantor of Algerian frontiers and the Algerian state, it knows it must be accepted. And to be accepted today means to take into account the millions of people who've been in the street. It also means encouraging economic reforms to allow a country which is run by a heavy bureaucracy to liberalize, open up, and to clean up a measure of corruption.
Can I just add?
Yeah, go ahead.
So if we're looking at what the Algerian people want and some of the actors now that are calling for genuine reforms and change, many people are very explicit that they do not want the stepping in of the army. They're very clear. If you're looking at the National Coordination of Change, one of the groups now that are looking at national dialogue and a roadmap for reforms that contests the one outlined by Bouteflika. One of the main aims is for Bouteflika to step down, but they're also reiterating calls that the army should not step in, because for them this represents an obstacle to the democratization of the country and something that may regress into a situation where the people are not in control.
Yasmina, what is the risk of these demonstrations erupting in violence? You know, there was a lot of violence in the 90s, after those disputed elections, elections in which the Islamist parties were thought to have won, and 200,000 people were killed in violence after that. I mean, is there a risk here that these demonstrations could descend into violence?
So the Algerian population have shown a sense of maturity in learning from their history, as well as what they perceive as the mistakes of the country's post-Arab Spring. For them, there's been a constant reiteration of silmiya, which is peacefulness and to conduct themselves in a peaceful manner, so as to not provoke any sense of violence or the first bullets being sprayed, which they know will then descend into something that will be out of their control and will descend the country into something sinister, as was witnessed in the 90s of the Civil War. So far, we've seen a month of protests. You know, on Friday, perhaps the largest protests ever recorded, with the newspapers stating there were around 15 million people across the country protesting. Very few incidences were recorded, which is a remarkable feat. So the people recognize that so long as they retain this peacefulness and this clear objective of demands that they have, then the control will remain within themselves, and they recognize that in order for them to be able to gain those demands without having any of the government officials stating that this was the reason why they cannot be listened to is because of this violence, they know now that they have to conduct themselves in a way in which their demands will be met.
Mohamed, looking a little bit more closely at Bouteflika, he was credited at some point with bringing stability to the country after that violence in the 90s. So was there a point where he fell out of favor with the Algerian people?
Well, you know, for this credit, I think, you know, this is questionable, you know, because the stability of Algeria has been worked out by President Lamine Zeroual. And he worked, you know, when Bouteflika came, you know, almost the stability was there. Now, the problem with what he brought in 1999 and today, it's 20 years. And the main concern for Algerians, you know, the Bouteflika cannot run the country. You know, he's sick like for the last 7 years, since 2013, you know, the guy has been, you know, between hospitals in France and Switzerland. So now what frightens me as an Algerian, it's like, you know, I think it's about time for these protesters in the streets and for all Algerians to see some results, some success in this month of the demonstrations and marches. And for the time being, not much has happened. And the army is there, but, you know, they didn't take any decision. But if it's going to last this way, I'm afraid that, you know, we may run into some problems. And the main challenge is, you know, they have to move on, you know. Now, Bouteflika is not going to seek a fifth term. Okay, it's there. But what after Bouteflika, you know, he has to go, and who is going to run this transitional period? This is the question. You know, the streets, you know, the 16 million or 18 million who were out in the streets last Friday, they are there, but this is not enough to make a move and to change the system. And, you know, to organize what Algerians, what these people in the streets are looking for, you know. Who is going to organize the whole thing? Are we going to see like a high council of state, like what happened in 1992, with 2 or 3 or 4 persons, you know, high profile Algerian politicians, yeah, to run and take over and organize this national conference and have a national dialogue with all the political forces in Algeria to just agree on, how to go over the constitution, because, it has to be changed, how to put a new law of, vote of caste, etc., etc.
Youcef Bouandel, do you see a sort of clear front-runner among the opposition leaders that's emerging who could take over from Bouteflika?
Well, the opposition in Algeria has been discredited. If you're talking about the opposition identified in so many political parties, we see, for instance, some of the parties that were supposedly in opposition, but they have been working with the system. As far as the official opposition is concerned, none of them is credible in the eyes of the Algerian people. But as far as I'm concerned, I think Algeria at the moment needs a figure from the past, linking the past to the present, somebody who is credible in the eyes of the Algerian people. For instance, Zarwal, who was president, he gave up the presidency, could be a very good person to run this transition period and to make the link between the old generation and the new generation.
All right. Francis Ghiles, politics aside, if we look at the current state of the Algerian economy, it relies very heavily on oil and gas for its earnings. But if over the past decade, its oil production has dropped by something like 400,000 barrels a day, and a lot of that has been blamed on poor management in the oil industry. Now we have foreign investors like ExxonMobil. They're delaying their plans to invest in Algeria because of this political uncertainty. What is the state of the economy right now?
Well, the state of the economy is poor, but one of the first things that is needed in any transition are people, and they exist in Algeria. There are plenty of competent former officials, oil and gas people, to come up with a serious economic plan, because it's not as if Algeria is the poorest country in the world. It's wasted a lot of money in the last 20 years when the prices of oil and gas, which is its main export more than oil, there's been a lot of corruption in that sector. But the first thing that's needed is somebody to go and talk on television to Algerian people and explain the situation, which is not desperate, but it's difficult. And there again, the previous interveners mentioned some names. I think you can perfectly well imagine a presidency and a government which brought together a few historical names who haven't been seen on television for many years, but if they went on television, people would listen, and younger people, people who fought for human rights. But there's any number of talents in Algeria. One could bring together a government of all the talents with a number of people who are experienced. The advantage of Yamin Zerwal or Mouloud Hamrouche is that not only the officers, which matters, because the Algerian army will not fade into the distance. The Algerian army has got to learn to remove itself more from immediate politics. That's the key point. But on the other hand, you need people who understand the machinery of government. Right. And I think there is plenty of talent in Algeria, and people who are politically savvy, and also people who would know that General Zerwal stepped out of his house in Batna the other day, greeted the crowd and wrote a letter encouraging the young people to march in the streets. So people like him and Hamrouche would have no problem, despite being 75, of speaking to young people, and at least people would listen. That's the key point.
Right, Yasmina, talking about young people, Algeria has a very young population. 2/3 of the country's 42 million people are under the age of 30, but unemployment is also very high among young people. What role are they playing in these current protests?
Hi.
So we've seen during the protests many students from universities to schools have taken a really active role. Many of the faces that you're seeing are representative of the very young population, 70% of whom are under the age of 30. As mentioned of how historical figures that the people would be palatable to the people, can bridge the gap between the past and the present. There's also this disconnect between looking at the war veterans. Many of the elites have used their status of that to legitimize their power stranglehold. And now you're seeing this young generation who are reclaiming their history and refusing to accept leaders that have the legitimacy in the past. You know, one of the key figures of the national movement during the independence war, Yasmina was seen in protests actively accepted by the people, and then she released a letter in which she called on young Algerians to continue their protests and to not let them steal your victory, which is of course a massive way to encourage Algerians to maintain their protests and to maintain their demands, which the young population have done.
Youcef Bouandel, very quickly, I've only got about a minute left. What are the regional implications of what is happening in Algeria right now, especially from the neighboring countries, countries like Tunisia, Morocco, Egypt for that matter?
Well, it depends how these developments turn out. If the protest results in a proper democracy, in a peaceful transition to democracy, then I think that countries in the region will follow suit. They will learn, I mean, Algeria will provide a shining example for them, and we will follow suit. If unfortunately it turns violent, which I don't think so, then the repercussion would be very, very big, not only for countries, neighboring countries, but also for Europe. Let's not forget that France is about 700 kilometers, 1 hour flight from Algeria, and there will be an influx of refugees from Algeria to neighboring countries and to Europe, but I don't think this scenario will ever materialize. Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.